It's no exaggeration to say that Marvel is one of the most prolific and successful entertainment companies in the world. But it hasn't always been that way, and over the years, the biggest name in comics has produced some truly spectacular duds. These are Marvel's biggest failures. In 1978, Marvel was riding high off the success of its Incredible Hulk TV series. The time seemed right for a whole Marvel TV universe, and in another world, the Doctor Strange pilot movie might well have kicked it off. Watching it now, however, it's easy to see why that never happened. The filmmakers seem to have read Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's classic comics and then decided to make them as boring as possible. Instead of going to a distant Himalayan sanctuary to learn the mystic arts, Stephen Strange meets up with some old guy who lives in New York. And rather than being the daughter of an extra-dimensional warlord, his love interest Clea is just a regular old college student. Even if Doctor Strange had gone to series, it's hard to imagine anyone would still watch it today. Everyone in this movie seems to be in a contest to see who can have the worst hair, while Strange himself wears more gold chains than Mr. T. Unsurprisingly, the disco soundtrack hasn't aged any better, and neither have the so-called magic effects. One scene in which Strange travels to the astral plane looks like it should have been projected on the wall of a hippie nightclub a decade earlier. Overall, only one thing in the Doctor Strange pilot has actually aged well: an appearance by future Arrested Development icon Jessica Walter as the evil Morgan Le Fay.
Good for her.
Adapting a Marvel comic book seems like a can't-miss proposition. You've got the characters all laid out for you, a built-in audience, and decades worth of stories ripe for adaptation. But the producers of many of these movies seem to think what fans really love about the comics is the names, because that's about all that made it into 1979's Captain America and its follow-up, Death Too Soon. The hero is still a military vet named Steve Rogers, but that's where the resemblance to the comic books comes to an end. Instead of doggedly trying to enlist to fight the fascists, Rogers just wants to drive around and discover himself. And while it's never easy for a flesh-and-blood actor to pull off Cap's over-the-top getup, it's hard to imagine a faithful adaptation looking any worse than the ridiculous outfit Steve dons for the end of the first movie and the rest of the second. No wonder they kept it off-screen so long. It's also kinda hard to get viewers excited when the cast all sound so damn bored, including Reb Brown as Cap himself. Put it this way, it's not exactly the Winter Soldier. In 1990, the head honchos over at Marvel pulled up their socks, wiped away their tears, and gave Captain America another go. And it was terrible. While the 70s TV movie had drastically altered Cap's suit, this time the project suffered from the opposite problem. Director Albert Pyan later said, "I petitioned them over and over to let me adjust the Captain America costume, but they were adamant it had to be the one in the comic." What looks good on the page doesn't look good on the screen, however, and certainly not on a budget. As a result, poor Cap was saddled with this wrinkly, rubbery mess. Bizarrely, inside that suit is Matt Salinger, son of the famously reclusive Catcher in the Rye author J.D. Salinger. The script doesn't do him any favors either, putting him in the role of a superhero who never actually seems to win a fight. He even loses during his first time out in World War II when his enemy, the Red Skull, straps him to a missile aimed at the White House. But hey, at least Cap manages to steer it to a harmless landing in the Arctic Ocean, which is mostly impressive in that it makes absolutely no sense. Captain America was the work of Israeli-American super schlockmaster Menachem Golan. So nonsense is par for the course. This was one of the first movies he made after the collapse of his Canon film group. Given that this was how he chose to start his new venture at 21st Century Films, well, you can guess how long that lasted. The Fantastic Four may be one of the most beloved teams in Marvel comic books and ushered in the Marvel Age, but they haven't had half as much luck in the movies. In the 90s, producer Bernd Eichinger was about to lose his rights to the characters, and he needed a quick, cheap movie to keep them from expiring. So he went to a man who knew quick and cheap, B-movie maestro Roger Corman. The crew didn't realize they'd signed on for a corporate write-off though, and they took it all dead seriously. Despite their efforts, this is an action movie so cheap that it goes an hour without an action sequence, and when we finally got one, it's about as underwhelming as you could possibly imagine. The Human Torch appears as a sub-bowling alley CGI creation, and they couldn't even make Mr. Fantastic's graying temples look real. And then it all ends like this. Unsurprisingly, the movie never got an official release, but the joke's on Eichinger, as he still lost all the rights. But hey, it could have been worse.
It's fantastic.
Say that again?
Before Samuel L. Jackson put on Nick Fury's eye patch, the role belonged to Baywatch beefcake David Hasselhoff. In fact, Hasselhoff claims Stan Lee himself called him the ultimate Nick Fury, though the fans apparently disagreed since his feature-length pilot never got a full series. This makes Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. a deeply strange viewing experience. It opens with armed goons stealing the frozen body of Hydra founder Baron von Strucker, but he's not actually thought out until the very end of the movie. Instead, the plot focuses on Strucker's daughter, who plans to overthrow the world's governments with the so-called Death's Head virus. This forces S.H.I.E.L.D. to recruit their former director, who they find wailing away at a concrete wall in a mineshaft for reasons we may never understand. There are also some hilarious special effects on show here, including a helicarrier that they somehow managed to make even more comic booky than the comic book, supported on what looked like table legs connected to skyscraper-sized jet engines. And then there's this robot dude who inexplicably lights up his eyes and wide-open mouth as a kind of living movie projector to deliver Strucker's message. So what did the later Fury think of all this? Speaking about his preparations for the role in an interview, Jackson said, "I watched David Hasselhoff and decided I was not going to do any of that." The first two issues of Marville are a broad superhero parody focused on Kal-El, a visitor from the future who tries to become a superhero. But with issue number 3, the story really goes off the deep end, as what little plot the reader is given disappears completely and the characters go on a journey to the dawn of time. Apparently this all happens so the comics writer-editor Bill Jemas can put his cranked-up theories about the origins of life in the mouth of God himself. As if that wasn't self-important enough, number 6 has Kal-El recap the series in the form of a sales pitch to an unseen editor who agrees that Jemas's crackpot ideas could bring about world peace. Sadly, they'll never sell, because the sheeple just want to read about superheroes beating each other up. And then, like the world's worst party guest, Marville just straight up refuses to leave. This 6-issue miniseries goes on to a 7th issue with submission guidelines for yet another forgotten failure, Jemas's short-lived revival of epic comics. How do you sell a book like this? As it turns out, the covers didn't even try, instead featuring allegedly sexy art by Greg Horn of a woman who never appears in the book, getting more and more undressed as the sales dropped lower. The writing was on the wall for Marvel imprint Epic Comics when it launched with Trouble. The idea was sound. American comics had largely ignored the female half of their audience since the romance genre went out in the 80s, so why not revive it for a new generation? But the execution was doomed from day one. To appeal to teen girls, editor Bill Jemas tapped kick-ass writer Mark Miller, whose primary audience was the kind of edgy teen boys that teen girls normally avoid. Predictably, he went as over the top with the sex as he normally does with violence, leeringly chronicling the over-the-top erotic lives of teenagers named May, Ben, Mary, and Richard. If those names sound familiar, well, there's the other problem. The series was heavily hinted to be a Spider-Man prequel, which means Marvel expected readers to get invested in the love life of Spidey's Aunt May. Worse, the series introduced a major rewrite of the superhero's secret origins that writers and fans have wisely ignored ever since. May cheats on Ben with a whole bunch of people, including Richard, and he and Mary end up raising little baby Peter as their own. That's right, Spider-Man's aunt is really his mother. This soap opera twist didn't help the series much, and it flopped so hard, it took almost a decade before Marvel would reprint it. The Ultimate Universe was the farthest thing from a forgotten failure, but 10 years into its existence, this new line of updated heroes wasn't so new and up-to-date anymore. The Ultimate line needed a shakeup, and it got one in Jeff Loeb and David Finch's 2009 Ultimatum miniseries. But instead of opening up new possibilities, the series closed off existing ones, killing off so many characters that there were hardly any left to write about. Ultimatum only begins to make sense in light of the then contemporary torture fad in horror movies because it's kind of like a superpowered Saw. The plot follows Magneto as he decides to wipe out humanity for good, but this is basically just a thin excuse to kill off character after character. Some of their exits are insultingly offhanded, others are so gory they're like a parody of adult comics. The Wasp gets eaten alive, Doctor Strange appears for all of 2 pages to fight a bad guy who has nothing to do with the main plot, just so we can see the Sorcerer Supreme's head turn purple and explode. Even when the story seems to be over, Loeb adds an epilogue with little purpose but to add Cyclops and Doctor Doom's deaths onto the pile. Fans weren't impressed, of course, and Ultimatum ultimately lost tens of thousands of readers by the end of its 5-issue run. Not every failure is deserved, however, and it's a tragic fact that many great comic book characters and stories have been consigned to the footnotes of history. Plenty of Marvel series have come and gone over the years without ever selling enough to sustain themselves, no matter how cleverly written or beautifully drawn they were. And that was the fate of Thor, the Mighty Avenger. The series brought in the iconic writer Roger Langridge to create new adventures for Thor without all the baggage of his decades of continuity. He came back with an origin story focusing on Thor's struggle to return to Asgard and his romance with Jane Foster. Chris Samney took on art duties, creating expressive characters and inventive designs for new versions of classic Marvel characters. But even the hype of Marvel's first Thor movie wasn't enough to keep the book afloat. It ended after less than a year, and the final issue suggests the creative team had little notice since it concludes without answering the story's most pressing questions. Tragically, Roger Langridge hasn't worked for Marvel since. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more Looper videos about Marvel Entertainment are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.